the government is actively funding journalists that they are choosing, while at the same time somehow stifling the free expression of online news media, for example, or independent media that may not be taking government money, you've got a serious problem with free expression in Canada.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Canadian Taxpayers podcast. My name is Franco Terrazzano, the federal director out here in Ottawa. And we've got a doozy, a very special, special episode of the podcast. Let's call it that, because I'm here with my two best friends, Ryan Thorpe, our investigative journalist, who's also holding down the fort right behind this wall here in Ottawa, and Chris Sims. So I have both of them. Chris Sims obviously is our Alberta director, who you all know. Now I have them both of them on the show because I want to talk about the press, the situation here in Canada, both how much money the government is giving to the media, right, in subsidies to the CBC, etc. But also, too, I want to talk about censorship. Let's talk about that as well. And these are probably one of the two of the best people in Canada to talk about this. Ryan, before we scooped him up, was at the Winnipeg Free Press. And Simmer, not to disclose how many years you have in service in the fight here, but you spent a couple decades before coming to the CTF in journalism. So let's get right into it, folks. Ryan, let's start off the bat. How much money are taxpayers forking over to fund the media here in Canada?
Well, the reality is it can be tough to keep track of it all because the federal government has announced so many different initiatives for the press in recent years. So one of the big ticket items is the $595 million newspaper bailout. This is often what people are thinking about when they're talking about media subsidies, particularly for privately owned media in this country. And that breaks down between, tax credits, labor subsidies, everything that's kind of involved in that big pool of money. That breaks down to about $13,750 per reporter in private newsrooms in terms of their actual salary that's covered by the federal government. But it doesn't stop there. There's also what's called the Local Journalism Initiative, which is another $50 million pool of money the federal government earmarked for the private press. There was $60 million that the industry got in pandemic support over the past few years. And then there was a $10 million special measures for journalism top up. So when you add all of that together, just in regards to the private press in this country, setting aside the CBC, more than $700 million has been promised by the federal government to the private press in Canada. And then I also think it's worth mentioning Bill C-18, right? The Online News Act, which is the federal government's pay for link scheme, which is essentially an attempt to kind of twist the arms of big tech into forking over even more money to private news outlets. And so, yeah, that's kind of the overview, the big picture in terms of the private press in this country, how much taxpayer dollars are going towards it.
Just picking up on what Ryan said, if you break down how much per reporter they're getting in government money or taxpayers' money, the folks over at Canadaland did the math and they broke it down to about $13,000 per reporter.
Wow.
So let's just, walk through that. So imagine that you're a reporter. Just for fun, imagine you're a reporter working on Parliament Hill and that $13,000 of your paycheck is coming from that government. If you know that, how on earth are you supposed to call that game straight? Like, you can't. It's just like in ethics. It's the perception of bias, okay, that erodes the trust and really kills the trust. So imagine if you're a reporter, you're chasing down a minister, say the Minister of Heritage, say they wasted a whole bunch of taxpayers' money, and you're going to hold them to account. You're going to stick a mic in their face. But $13,000 of your paycheck, maybe even the existence of your job, hinges on money coming from that guy's ministry. It's just not going to work. This is exactly why this is a conflict of interest to have the government paying journalists.
And it's not just the journalists too, right? Like, what about the executives in the corporate press, right? Like, if they want a handout from the taxpayer, I mean, look, I've never worked in a newsroom, which actually maybe makes me the perfect person to talk about perception. I've never worked in a newsroom, right? So I don't really know exactly what goes on, but the perception certainly is like, look, everyone knows you don't really want to bite too hard on the hand that feeds you. And it might not even be a journalist. It could be the higher ups, right? The executive team who wants the money that's coming from government. And I mean, I know I don't need to remind you guys, probably don't even need to remind our listeners, but it's not just the corporate press, the private media that is getting this corporate welfare. Let's call it what it is, right? It's also the Crown Corporation, our favorite state broadcaster, the CBC, that takes in more than $1 billion every year from taxpayers, right? So hundreds of millions of dollars in this corporate press media bailout, but then you also get $1 billion every single year from taxpayers going to the CBC. So, I mean, that adds up, folks, right? 10 years, 12 years, the CBC funding alone, you're looking at more than $10 billion or more than $12 billion. But Ryan, why don't you kind of go in there and break in some of the nuance as well on how the CBC is getting funding and spending our money?
For sure, yeah. So the CBC gets more than $1.2 billion from taxpayers every single year. And I think it's interesting to look, okay, well, where is that money going, right? Whenever there's talk of defund the CBC, CBC executives are quick to come out and say, oh, well, what about, Indigenous language services? What about Northern radio services that we offer? This is a very, very tiny, small portion of the CBC's overall budget that actually goes to that. What we do know when we've dug into the numbers, when we filed access to information requests, is that in 2022 alone, the CBC handed out $16 million in bonuses to their staff. That was on top of $12 million in raises. And if you back it up to 2015, when Justin Trudeau was first elected as prime minister, $185 million in bonuses alone have been dished out at the CBC. Also worth pointing out, viewership and ratings, not good, right? Not a lot of people are even watching the programming that they're putting out. But particularly from my standpoint, as someone that used to work in the newspaper business in this country, the biggest thing for me is that the CBC has been engaged in kind of a mission creep over the past few years, where they've gotten into the private advertising game, where they are now competing with private news outlets for advertising, because the $1.2 billion from taxpayers that they're getting, apparently that's not enough. They need to add to that pool of money by going after private advertising. So what the federal government is effectively doing is they're subsidizing this public media outlet that simply has resources that no private outlet in this country can compete with. The CBC is then doing the same job, covering the same stories that private news outlets try to, then turns around and gives away the product for free, while also competing with advertising. So just every step along the way, the CBC is undercutting the ability of private media in this country to make a profit, to earn a living, to keep themselves afloat. And I mean, an obvious point is like, maybe there wouldn't be a need for, the newspaper bailout and all these private media subsidies if the CBC would just simply get out of the game and stop undercutting all of their efforts at being profitable.
Yeah, for sure, Ryan. I don't have as much experience in print, real quick there, sorry, Franco, as you do there in Winnipeg. But I remember distinctly, a few years ago, guys, when the CBC put up their hashtag no paywall. Like, they were promoting the fact that they were putting a whole lot of print content online, and they were also promoting the fact that there's no paywall. So like deliberately undercutting private newspapers, which were trying to put up paywalls in order to pay their people.
In Winnipeg, I can think of many examples where we would break stories at the Winnipeg Free Press. The CBC would then match those stories, right? And then turn around and put them out for free. So they're literally matching the same work as the private media outlets, but then putting that information out for free, not behind a paywall, just totally undercutting the ability of the private media in this country to sustain itself.
Hey guys, I love all of this. I just want to interject one quick thing, because Ryan, you've been talking about the bonuses that were being handed out. And I just think this is important to remind our viewers. Okay, mm-hmm. So the last economic update, the last budget update from Freeland essentially gave the CBC an extra $42 million to help the CBC recover through the pandemic, right? Isn't that nice? And that's $42 million extra on top of the $1 billion plus they get every single year. So they got an extra $42 million from the feds to help them recover through the pandemic. Well, since the beginning of the pandemic, they handed out $46 million in bonuses. You see that math? an extra 42 million to help recover from the pandemic, then an extra 46 million dollars in bonuses to their employees during the pandemic, right? So that just doesn't really add up to me. I do want to get into that a little bit of the conflict of interest. Chris, let me tee you up though. Kind of explain the scenario of when the CBC was created versus now, and then kind of talk about the conflict of interest that is created by having a government-funded media organization.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of people, myself included, for a long time thought that the CBC Radio Canada was the first ever radio station in the country. No, that's not true. There were around 100 or so private radio stations across the country back when the CBC was first fired up. And when it first got started, it was created just as a radio station in order to broadcast like the weather to farmers, right? To give you updates on what was happening during the Second World War, and also to kind of compete with some of the radio dramas and the soap operas. By the way, they were literally called soap operas because they were soap commercials on the radio and they had dramas around them. It was in order to compete with some of the radio dramas and soap operas coming out of Chicago and New York. And so now we're hearing the same old age-old thing of, oh, we have to put out Canadian content, to thwart the Americans. The thing is Canadian radio stations were already doing that. We had everything from talk shows out here in the prairies to radio orchestras broadcasting live from downtown Toronto. So all of that was happening before the CBC even went on the air. Nowadays, obviously, you can get the hockey game anywhere, and farmers spend a lot of money on their fancy satellite programs to find out the weather minute by minute. And so if we're looking at it now, 2023, the idea of the government providing you information, providing you news while they're being paid by taxpayers is an inherent conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. If you're counting on the government for your paycheck, you cannot hold the government to account. It's just obvious.
Hey, So another thing I just want to jump in, Ryan, is like the idea that you would even need the government to promote like Canadians to make it big now is like just so hilariously silly. You know what I mean? Like, first of all, nobody's like think about the viewership and listenership of the CBC. Like, if you're relying on the CBC to make it big, you ain't making it big. You know what I mean? But like, also, like, just think of like who's probably the most famous Canadian to come out in the last 20 years or so? Justin Bieber. He just did that through YouTube. Like, there's so many different ways. Like, it's never been easier and cheaper than ever to get your message out to like countless, not just Canadians, but millions of people in North America and around the world. Now, Ryan, since you are hot off the press, we literally scooped you out straight from a newspaper. Can you kind of provide like your insight, like what you think about this conflict of interest and the government funding?
Yeah, well, the newspaper I spent the vast majority of my career at was called the Winnipeg Free Press, or is called the Winnipeg Free Press. And, sometimes people would come after me on social media or different reporters on staff and be like, well, this is behind a paywall. It's not free, right? Why are you called the Winnipeg Free Press? And it's a misunderstanding of what free in the context of a free press actually means. And free, the free press, the freedom there, it means freedom from government, right? From no funding, no interference, no censorship, right? And, a free press is a foundation of, any sort of like pluralistic democratic society. And journalists need to be able to freely investigate and write stories, right? They need to be able to speak truth to power. Journalistic analysis or editorial lines, they can be left-wing, they can be right-wing, they can be centrist. That's fine. I don't particularly have an issue with it as long as people are honest and kind of upfront about their priors and where they're coming from. But it can't be funded by the government. Right? It can't be, or it doesn't work. Journalism, to function properly, to fulfill its role, its very important role in society, it needs to stand on its own two feet. And this is something I've heard Chris say over and over again. Journalists should not be paid by the government, full stop. And the fact that this even needs to be said in 2023 shows the extent to which Canadian news media has absolutely fallen. Like, it's embarrassing that this is even a conversation that needs to be had, because it is so basic and so elementary.
It is. Yeah. And I can hear the passion in Ryan's voice there, Franco. If you want to jump in there, that's fine too. speaking personally, and I don't want to speak for Ryan, but journalism is a calling for most people. Most of the good journalists I knew back in the industry, they felt compelled to be a journalist. So they liked sticking up for the little guy, right? One of my old bureau chiefs used to say, it's our job to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And coming from like kind of a rural working class background, I found myself plopped in the middle of the halls of power quite often, or at, different receptions and things like that. And it was my job to be able to question these powerful people. And that is a privilege that not a lot of everyday people get a chance to do. And so it's really a matter of trust that a lot of Canadians are giving you if you're acting as a journalist. And what I find interesting is that, going back to the CBC, one of the main shows on the CBC is called The Fifth Estate. So what the heck does that mean? Well, that's because the first three classical estates of the realm are supposed to be the clergy, the nobility, and the rest of the population. The fourth estate was initially meant to be kind of what we would nowadays call the mainstream press, generally speaking. The fifth estate in concept is supposed to be kind of the independent, freewheeling, muckraking level of the press. I find it interesting that it was the CBC that picked up on that name and started using it. But this is all getting back to the fact that the tradition of W5, who, what, where, when, why, fact-finding level of journalism has been happening here for a long time. It's been with us for a long time, to Ryan's point, in democracies. And I think that's why so many people have a bad relationship with journalism now and with the press, because they don't know who to trust anymore.
Okay, that's a really interesting place to kind of leave your comments there, Chris. Like, people don't know who to trust. One of the lines that I think about quite often is that when you think of media and journalism, it's supposed to be holding the powerful to account with the people, not holding the people accountable to the powerful. What is the most powerful institution in Canada? The government. It is the most powerful institution of government, right? They're the monopoly of violence, some people would say, or of force or coercion or whatever you want to call it. So they truly are the powerful, all levels of government, the bureaucrats, the politicians, and everyone connected to the government through special privileges or corporate welfare or whatever. Now, Ryan, just as anecdotes, I hear a lot of people saying, I don't trust the media. Now, we work directly with a lot of good people in the media, but unfortunately, I think they're painted with this broad brush because they know so much of the corporate press is being subsidized directly from the government. A lot of polls show that people are losing trust in much of the media landscape as well. Ryan, again, we just scooped you up from the press. Can you just provide some insights, some anecdotes, maybe some polling data that you've seen on this issue?
Yeah, well, the first thing to point out, I would say, is that news publishers, newspaper publishers, publishers of private media in this country, they sold the industry's integrity down the river by petitioning the federal government for endless handouts. And so I think it's quite right for the public to look at this when the private press is being subsidized by the federal government to the extent it is, and say, well, how are these people supposed to hold the government accountable when the government is signing their paychecks, right? And a very basic lesson that I learned in journalism school that I would imagine any journalist in this country who went to J school learned, probably week one, was that you not only avoid real conflicts of interest when you're reporting on stories, you avoid even the perception of one, right? Well, here, they've thrown that out the window, and they have purposely stepped into a very real conflict of interest. And that is absolutely having an impact on public trust in the press, because public trust is falling about as fast as industry stock prices and profit margins are at this point. There was some recent polling out of the United States that found that 61% of respondents now believe that the press, that journalists are actively lying to them, right? Not that journalists are torquing things a little bit around the margins or perhaps get things wrong sometimes, and the mistakes, surprise, surprise, always seem to trend in the same direction. No, that they're actually trying to mislead them, that is a damning indictment to the state of the press. And quite frankly, at least in the Canadian context, as long as journalists and news outlets are being subsidized by the federal government, the public shouldn't trust them, quite frankly, because they've sold their integrity out the window.
And, picking up on that, Ryan, when you combine this, so 61%, like you just said, of people now think that they're actively trying to mislead them with statements they know to be false. So not a typo, not mispronouncing somebody's name by mistake or an oopsie. That's pretty harsh to hear, but it's a truth that we have to listen to, or we're not going to fix this. When you combine all of this, so the funding, the lack of trust, all of these problems with the industry, with the fact that now the federal government is deciding who a journalist is, who a qualified journalist is, and then they're actively paying that journalist with the consequences of something like Bill C-11, where they're trying to strangle free expression online by downgrading whether or not they're Canadian or not enough or not. So that's going to be through the CRTC. You've got those two things happening at the same time. So on one hand, the state, the government is actively funding journalists that they are choosing, while at the same time, somehow stifling the free expression of online news media, for example, or independent media that may not be taking government money. You've got a serious problem with free expression in Canada. A lot of people call it free speech. In Canada, it's called free expression. So this is a major problem. And again, it leads back to the fact that why are we raising a ruckus about this? Well, our mandate is lower taxes, less waste, and accountable government. So this hits all three, but especially accountable government, because if we don't have a free press, free from the government, folks are going to have a real hard time holding that government to account.
Chris, you just put such a nice bow on that. I say nice. It's quite scary sometimes when you think about it, right? On the one hand, you have unelected bureaucrats and, of course, our elected politicians funding the media, both private and the state broadcaster. And then on the other hand, you're going to have unelected bureaucrats, essentially deciding to an extent what we see or don't see online on our social media platforms. So a very scary and potentially dangerous combo. I think you put it very well. So with that, folks, look, I know you guys are both very, very busy. I just want to say thanks for coming on here and really shedding some light on this issue that's very close to home for you and to much of our listeners. To our listeners, if this conversation inspires you to take some action, good, it should. The first thing that you need to do is head over to taxpayer.com and sign the petition to defund the CBC and end the media bailout.